In the mid-19th century, the grandeur of the British monarchy concealed a genetic fragility that would alter the course of dynastic history. Queen Victoria, who came to the throne in 1837, carried within her lineage an invisible inheritance, the mutation for hemophilia, a rare blood-clotting disorder that would come to be known as the royal curse. The condition condemned its male victims to prolonged suffering, where even the smallest injury could lead to fatal hemorrhage. Medical records of the period describe infants who bled uncontrollably after routine procedures, physicians powerless to intervene with anything beyond ice compresses, herbal tonics, or the ill-advised use of leeches. The most visible early victim was Queen Victoria's eighth son, Prince Leopold. Born in 1853, he grew up under constant medical supervision, his childhood marked by frequent hemorrhages and swollen joints that left him bedridden for weeks. Simple falls that other children would laugh away became life-threatening episodes. His doctors advised against horseback riding, military service, or any activity considered essential for a man of royal birth. Despite his constraints, Leopold lived longer than many expected, but in 1884, a minor fall led to a brain hemorrhage, and he died at the age of 30. His death left the royal family shaken, and the European courts watching with unease. Secrecy surrounded the illness from the start. The monarchy was built on ideals of strength and divine favor, and to admit weakness was to invite questions about legitimacy. Yet rumors spread quickly through diplomatic circles. Foreign envoys noted the Queen's delicate son and whispered about a mysterious affliction that seemed to pass through the bloodline. Physicians of the time had no knowledge of genetics, but patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Daughters carried the condition silently, while sons often died young. What medicine could not yet explain, superstition eagerly filled, with some interpreting the deaths as divine punishment, others whispering of a curse attached to Victoria's throne. The tragedy extended beyond Britain. Two of Victoria's daughters, Princess Alice and Princess Beatrice, carried the gene into the royal houses of Germany, Spain, and Russia. In each court, princes born to these women inherited the same vulnerability, and their untimely deaths echoed Leopold's fate. As the 19th century progressed, hemophilia became an open secret among Europe's ruling families. Marriages once forged for political strength now carried the risk of genetic disaster. Behind closed doors, mothers lived in dread of minor cuts or childhood accidents that might end in funerals. Diaries and correspondence reveal the constant tension of life under the shadow of the illness. By the close of the century, hemophilia was no longer an obscure medical curiosity, but a force shaping dynastic decisions. It strained diplomatic marriages, tarnished the aura of invulnerability surrounding monarchs, and haunted every royal nursery where the descendants of Queen Victoria were born. The royal curse had emerged, and its most devastating consequences were yet to unfold. Sidue. Before we continue into the medical secrecy and stigma of the Victorian court, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us trace how far this story of bloodlines and history reaches today. Within the walls of the Victorian court, medicine was both a trusted advisor and a source of profound limitation. The 19th century was a period of immense scientific curiosity, yet practical treatments remained primitive. For those afflicted by hemophilia, the physicians of Queen Victoria's era could do little more than observe, record, and attempt remedies rooted in centuries-old practices. Medical documentation from the period details the repeated application of ice, the administration of opiates for pain, and the futile use of leeches, an approach that often left patients weaker and more vulnerable to infection. At court, the very presence of the illness carried not only medical consequences but also social stigma. To admit that a royal child was chronically ill was to confess weakness in a dynasty that drew its legitimacy from ideas of divine blessing and natural strength. The secrecy was deliberate. Diaries kept by household staff refer obliquely to delicate health and sudden weakness, never naming hemophilia directly, as if to do so would solidify the condition's hold over the family. Even the queen herself was often reluctant to speak openly of the disease, preferring to frame her son Leopold's fragility as a matter of temperament rather than a fatal diagnosis. The medical community, still in the early stages of systematizing clinical records, struggled to describe what they observed. Physicians noted that hemophilia appeared to strike boys while sparing their sisters, an inheritance pattern they could not explain. Some suggested it was nature's curse upon the male line, while others framed it in moral terms, proposing that it represented divine punishment for arrogance or excess. In this climate, superstition thrived alongside science. Within the court, whispers of a family curse found fertile ground among courtiers, eager to interpret illness as evidence of political weakness. But the stigma did not end with gossip. The condition began to influence dynastic decisions. Prospective suitors for Victoria's daughters quietly weighed the risk of bringing such a disorder into their own houses. Some withdrew negotiations altogether, leaving the queen to navigate delicate political situations with an illness no one dared to name publicly. In diplomatic circles, the matter became a silent but powerful factor in marriage alliances, reshaping the very foundations of European aristocratic politics. Behind the closed doors of the nursery, the lived experience was one of constant dread. Mothers hovered over their sons with anxious vigilance, knowing that a stumble on the palace stairs or a poorly timed fall in the garden could mean slow death. In one recorded case, a young grandson of Victoria bled internally for days after a minor bump to his knee, physicians powerless to arrest the hemorrhage. The boy's mother, Princess Alice, confided in letters that she felt cursed, guilty for transmitting a disease she did not understand. These private writings reveal the psychological burden borne by royal women who unknowingly carried the mutation, yet could not prevent its effects in their children. The Victorian medical establishment, though advanced compared to earlier centuries, lacked the conceptual tools to grasp genetic inheritance. The work of Gregor Mendel on heredity, conducted in the 1860s, was not widely known until decades later. Thus hemophilia remained cloaked in mystery. It was observed, it was feared, and it was managed with secrecy, but it could not be explained. The monarchy, dependent on image and stability, did what it had always done when faced with scandal or weakness. It closed ranks, concealed what it could, and projected strength to the public. Yet within that concealment lay the seeds of instability. The attempt to suppress knowledge of the illness could not stop its spread. As daughters of Victoria married into Europe's most powerful dynasties, they carried with them not only royal blood, but also the hidden mutation. The combination of medical ignorance, cultural stigma, and dynastic ambition ensured that the so-called royal curse would not remain confined to Britain. It was only the beginning of its journey across Europe's royal houses. As the 19th century advanced, the British Empire extended its influence across the globe, and so too did the genetic disorder carried within Queen Victoria's bloodline. In an age when dynastic marriages were instruments of political strategy, daughters of the Queen were positioned as vital links in the great chain of European alliances. Yet these alliances, forged for stability, inadvertently spread the mutation for hemophilia across multiple thrones. What began as a hidden condition in the British royal nursery soon became a medical and political crisis felt in courts from Berlin to Madrid, and ultimately St. Petersburg. Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter, married Prince Louis of Hesse and carried the mutation into the German states. Her descendants would bear the mark of hemophilia with tragic consequences. Historical records detail how several of Alice's sons exhibited symptoms consistent with the disorder, including uncontrolled bleeding from minor injuries. Letters preserved from Alice reveal her anguish. She wrote of the unbearable guilt she felt as she watched her sons weaken from a condition she herself did not suffer, but had unknowingly transmitted. Her daughter, Olix of Hesse, would later marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, ensuring that the royal curse would enter the Romanov line, a union that proved catastrophic for both family and empire. Another daughter, Princess Beatrice, married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Like her sister, she too became an unwitting carrier. Through her children, the condition spread into the Spanish royal family. Infante Alfonso, son of Beatrice's daughter Victoria Eugenie and King Alfonso III of Spain, was among the most severely afflicted. Historical accounts describe how Alfonso bled profusely after minor dental surgery, a preventable incident that nearly claimed his life. His illness was an open secret in Madrid, where courtiers whispered about the British origins of the condition. For the Spanish monarchy, already fragile in the early 20th century, the presence of hemophilia in the heir's body undermined public confidence in the dynasty's future. The pattern was inescapable. Sons born into these dynasties faced shortened lives and constant medical crises. Daughters, meanwhile, carried the invisible burden of possibly transmitting the mutation to future generations. In some cases, marriage negotiations were disrupted once suspicions of hemophilia were raised. Potential husbands hesitated to wed women linked to Queen Victoria's line, fearful of introducing the disorder into their own bloodline. The result was a paradox. The very marriages intended to strengthen European monarchies instead seeded them with genetic fragility. By the dawn of the 20th century, the map of Europe's royal families was threaded with a single mutation. German princes, Spanish heirs, and Russian tsareviches alike suffered from the same devastating illness. Physicians began to notice the remarkable similarity between cases across courts, though without a full understanding of genetics. They attributed the phenomenon to coincidence or divine providence. The concept of a hereditary pattern linking distant royal houses remained speculative, whispered among doctors and diplomats, but not yet established in scientific terms. The secrecy surrounding the disorder only amplified its impact. Each court sought to minimize public knowledge, concealing the extent of their heirs' fragility. Yet the deaths of young princes could not be hidden entirely, and the repetition of such tragedies across Europe fueled speculation of a curse. The narrative of divine punishment for monarchies out of step with modernity gained traction in an age of rising republicanism. Monarchs who once symbolized permanence and stability now appeared fragile, dependent on heirs who might not survive childhood. This diffusion of hemophilia across Europe underscored the unforeseen consequences of dynastic ambition. The pursuit of political advantage through marriage spread not only influence but also genetic vulnerability. In the process, the royal curse transcended borders, binding together monarchies that would soon confront the most turbulent decades of modern history. And among these dynasties, none would feel the devastating effects more than the Romanovs of Russia, whose heir, Tsarevich Alexei, would become the most famous and tragic victim of the blood disease. In 1904, the birth of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich was greeted with jubilation across the Russian Empire. After 4 daughters, Tsar Nicholas VI and Empress Alexandra had finally produced a male heir, a child who would secure the Romanov dynasty's future. But the joy was short-lived. Within months, the infant displayed alarming symptoms: unexplained bruises, prolonged bleeding from small cuts, and painful swelling in his joints. The physicians of the imperial household, sworn to secrecy, quickly realized the nature of his illness. The heir to the Russian throne had inherited hemophilia. For Empress Alexandra, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the revelation was devastating. She understood the shadow that hemophilia had already cast across her family in Europe. Letters to her sister, Princess Victoria of Hesse, reveal the Empress's profound sense of guilt. She saw herself as the unwilling vessel of a hereditary curse that could doom the future of Russia. As the boy's condition worsened, Alexandra withdrew further into despair, convinced that God had afflicted her son as punishment for her sins. Medical records detail the severity of Alexei's suffering. Episodes of bleeding often left him bedridden for weeks, his joints so swollen that movement caused excruciating pain. In one notorious episode in 1912, a minor fall during a family holiday in Poland triggered internal bleeding so severe that the boy hovered near death. His temperature rose, his pulse weakened, and priests were summoned to administer last rites. The court was paralyzed with fear that the dynasty's only male heir was slipping away. It was in this context of desperation that Empress Alexandra turned to unconventional sources of hope. Enter Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose reputation for healing reached the palace at precisely the moment the imperial family was most vulnerable. To the astonishment of court physicians, Rasputin's prayers and calming presence coincided with a dramatic improvement in Alexei's condition during several crises. While modern historians suspect that Rasputin's insistence on halting certain medical treatments, such as aspirin, then unknowingly worsening bleeding, may have spared the boy from further hemorrhage, to Alexandra it was nothing short of divine intervention. Rasputin's influence grew in direct proportion to Alexei's fragility. The Empress clung to him as the only man capable of preserving her son's life. Political advisors, generals, and ministers were dismayed as Rasputin gained access to the highest levels of power. The empire's stability became entangled with the medical fate of a single child. Hemophilia, once a private affliction whispered about in European courts, was now a force shaping the politics of a vast empire. The secrecy surrounding Alexei's condition became a matter of state security. To reveal that the heir to the throne was chronically ill would have emboldened enemies at home and abroad. Thus, official statements referred only to indispositions or accidents, while rumors spread among the public that something was gravely wrong. Revolutionaries seized upon these whispers, portraying the royal family as weak and cursed. The notion that the Tsar's son was doomed to die young fed into a broader narrative of imperial decline. For Nicholas II, the illness was both a personal torment and a political liability. The Tsar struggled to balance his devotion to his son with the demands of empire, often making decisions clouded by the desperation of a father unwilling to face the possibility of dynastic extinction. His reluctance to dismiss Rasputin, despite mounting scandal, stemmed directly from the mystic's apparent ability to preserve Alexei's fragile life. The boy's bleeding episodes, hidden from public view, nonetheless shaped state policy and eroded trust in the monarchy. The Romanov tragedy illustrates the full weight of hemophilia's impact. It was not merely a medical disorder. It was a destabilizing force that amplified superstition, empowered dubious figures, and weakened confidence in a dynasty already facing social unrest. The Tsarevich survived into adolescence, but his suffering remained constant, his survival uncertain, and his future impossible. In the crucible of Russia's political turmoil, the fragile body of one boy became a symbol of the monarchy's vulnerability. When the Romanov family was executed in 1918, Alexei's illness died with him, but its legacy endured. Historians now recognize that hemophilia's grip on the Russian heir directly contributed to the empire's instability. The desperation of a mother, the secrecy of a court, and the empowerment of a mystic, these were the unforeseen consequences of a single genetic mutation that had crossed borders from Britain to Russia. The so-called royal curse had helped prepare the ground for revolution. The tragedies that hemophilia inflicted upon Europe's ruling houses left behind a body of evidence that would prove invaluable to medical science. While the families themselves sought secrecy, their wealth and status ensured that every episode of illness was meticulously recorded by physicians. These private records, later studied by scientists, became some of the earliest large-scale clinical documentation of a hereditary disorder. What began as palace diaries and physicians' notes gradually evolved into the foundation of modern genetic understanding. In Britain, detailed reports on Prince Leopold's hemorrhages, his treatments, and the circumstances of his death were preserved by the royal household. German physicians maintained similar records for the sons of Princess Alice, carefully noting the frequency of bleeding episodes and the lack of recovery after routine injuries. In Spain, royal doctors documented the fragility of Alfonso, the hemophiliac son of Victoria Eugenie, noting with alarm how dental surgery nearly ended his life. And in Russia, the archives of the imperial household include extensive correspondence between Alexandra and her physicians, alongside testimony from Rasputin's interventions, which collectively illustrate the severity of Alexei's condition. These records revealed striking consistencies across different courts. Each case demonstrated the same hereditary pattern: healthy mothers who appeared unaffected, yet passed the disorder to their sons. The repeated observations led some physicians to speculate that the condition was transmitted through the maternal line, though they lacked the language of chromosomes or genetic coding to explain why. Theories abounded. Some argued that the disease slept in the blood of women, while others claimed it was a punishment passed from mother to son for sins unspoken. It was not until the early 20th century that the scientific world began to frame hemophilia in genetic terms. Gregor Mendel's pioneering work on inheritance, published in the 1860s, had initially gone unnoticed, but by the 1900s, researchers rediscovered his findings and applied them to human heredity. The royal families of Europe, by tragic circumstance, provided the perfect case study. The recurrence of hemophilia in specific family trees, always transmitted through daughters and expressed in sons, aligned perfectly with what would later be identified as X-linked inheritance. Medical journals of the early 20th century began to discuss the bleeder disease in technical terms, citing case studies drawn, often anonymously, from European courts. Geneticists mapped the disorder through the descendants of Queen Victoria, tracing how a single mutation in one woman's blood had spread across multiple dynasties. This research transformed hemophilia from a mysterious curse into one of the most important documented examples of hereditary disease. The documentation also advanced medical practice. Physicians recognized that certain treatments made the condition worse, particularly the use of aspirin, which thinned the blood and aggravated bleeding. Gradually, best practices emerged: strict avoidance of trauma, careful monitoring of even minor injuries, and compassionate care to ease the suffering of patients condemned to lives of fragility. These guidelines, though rudimentary, represented progress born from royal suffering. Yet the scientific progress contrasted sharply with the silence that still surrounded the illness in public life. Official statements rarely admitted to the existence of hemophilia in royal houses, and public obituaries often concealed the true cause of death. In this way, the families contributed to medical advancement, even as they perpetuated secrecy and stigma. It was an uneasy balance, royal bloodlines serving as case studies, but the truth withheld from the very subjects who revered them. By the 1920s and 1930s, hemophilia had become a central subject in the emerging field of medical genetics. Scientists studying heredity often referred, directly or indirectly, to the European royal families as the most visible demonstration of their theories. The condition, once shrouded in superstition, had become a cornerstone of genetic science. From diaries, autopsies, and confidential correspondence, a new understanding of heredity had been built. The irony was unavoidable. The suffering of princes and heirs, shielded by secrecy in their own time, laid the groundwork for discoveries that would benefit ordinary patients in the centuries to come. The royal curse had given rise not only to tragedy, but also to science. As hemophilia spread through the descendants of Queen Victoria, it became clear that this was more than a private medical matter. It was a destabilizing force in European politics, altering the perception of monarchy itself. Dynastic marriages, once the bedrock of continental diplomacy, were suddenly shadowed by the risk of introducing a fatal disorder into a ruling house. The illness transformed what had been celebrated as royal blood into a liability, and in doing so, weakened the very institution that relied on hereditary continuity for survival. In Spain, the illness of Infante Alfonso became a matter of whispered scandal. The son of King Alfonso XIII and Queen Victoria Eugenie, he suffered severe hemorrhages that left courtiers questioning whether the dynasty had a future. The Spanish monarchy, already fragile in the early 20th century, found itself undermined by rumors of weakness at its very core. Critics of the monarchy seized upon the prince's illness as symbolic of a decaying order, arguing that divine favor had departed from the crown. The narrative of cursed blood, already present in folklore, now attached itself to the throne in Madrid. In Germany, the sons of Princess Alice of Hesse died young from hemophilia, tragedies that rippled through the extended network of German principalities. While Germany itself was not destabilized by these losses, the repetition of the pattern deepened the sense that a single mutation was weaving fragility into the ruling fabric of Europe. The deaths were marked by private grief, but in public they contributed to the perception that monarchies were no longer invincible symbols of continuity. Russia represented the most catastrophic case. The illness of Tsarevich Alexei eroded confidence in the Romanov dynasty at a time of rising revolutionary sentiment. The secrecy surrounding his condition fostered suspicion and rumor, while the empress's reliance on Rasputin to preserve her son's life gave the appearance of a monarchy ruled by mysticism rather than reason. The intersection of hemophilia and political collapse in Russia demonstrates how the disorder moved beyond the body of an heir to shape the destiny of an empire. What began as a medical condition became, in effect, a political actor. The broader consequence was a shift in how royal marriages were perceived. In earlier centuries, alliances were arranged with little regard for health, focusing instead on territory, wealth, and influence. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, the specter of hemophilia forced courts to weigh the risks of bloodlines. The disorder discouraged unions with known carriers and limited the marriage prospects of daughters suspected of carrying the mutation. Dynastic politics, long dependent on an unbroken chain of alliances, became constrained by a new and very modern calculation: genetic risk. Public perception also shifted. Monarchs who had once embodied divine strength now appeared fragile, their heirs vulnerable to the same accidents and illnesses that haunted ordinary families, but with far higher stakes. The press, constrained but not entirely silenced, reported on the mysterious illnesses of royal children with veiled references. Pamphlets circulated suggesting that hemophilia was evidence of God's disfavor or a curse upon decadent monarchs. In an age of rising nationalism and republicanism, the idea that Europe's rulers carried diseased bloodlines became a potent rhetorical weapon. Hemophilia thus weakened monarchies in two ways. It directly reduced their capacity to secure healthy heirs, and it eroded the aura of invincibility upon which their legitimacy rested. The disorder transformed succession from a matter of certainty into one of constant anxiety. Every birth announcement was overshadowed by the fear of premature death, and every marriage negotiation carried the unspoken question: will this union bring health or fragility to the throne? By the early 20th century, the political fallout was unmistakable. Spain's monarchy faltered, Russia's collapsed, and Britain's House of Windsor carried the stigma of originating the curse. Though the disorder did not by itself topple dynasties, it became entwined with the broader crises of the age: war, revolution, and the decline of hereditary rule. In the court of public opinion, hemophilia symbolized the weakness of monarchies at precisely the moment when their survival required strength. The royal curse, once hidden in nurseries and physicians' diaries, had become a public narrative with profound political consequences. It reshaped the strategies of dynastic marriages, undermined confidence in ruling houses, and lent symbolic weight to movements that sought to end monarchy altogether. In this way, hemophilia was not only a genetic disorder, but also a silent participant in the great upheavals of modern European history. By the mid-20th century, the most dramatic consequences of hemophilia in Europe's royal families had already unfolded. The Romanovs were executed, Spain's monarchy weakened, and Britain had long since concealed the deaths of its hemophiliac princes behind guarded medical records. Yet the legacy of the disorder persisted, shaping how surviving carriers lived, how royal marriages were arranged, and how dynasties adapted to the awareness that their bloodlines were no longer invulnerable. For the daughters and granddaughters of Queen Victoria who lived into the 20th century, secrecy remained the defining strategy. Carriers of the hemophilia gene often avoided public acknowledgement, even within their own families. Letters preserved in private archives show mothers warning their daughters to marry strong men and to conceal any history of unexplained bleeding from prospective husbands. The disorder remained a taboo subject, one that could jeopardize not only marriage prospects, but also political alliances. Yet within this secrecy, stories of resilience emerged. Princess Alice of Battenberg, a great-granddaughter of Victoria and mother of Prince Philip, carried the mutation but did not pass the disorder to her children. Her survival into old age demonstrated that carriers could live healthy lives, and escape the stigma of being associated with the so-called curse. For others, however, the burden was heavier. Mothers who lost multiple sons to the disorder described themselves as cursed or punished, internalizing the superstition that had long surrounded the illness. Their diaries reveal cycles of grief, guilt, and resignation, passed down quietly through generations. Royal marriage policies shifted in subtle but profound ways. By the 1930s and 1940s, health considerations began to weigh more heavily in dynastic unions. Medical records were quietly requested, bloodlines scrutinized, and suspected carriers discreetly passed over. The once unquestioned practice of marrying within a small circle of royal houses gave way to broader selection, partly in response to the recognition that close intermarriage had concentrated genetic risks. This marked the beginning of a slow but decisive shift, away from dynastic strategy and toward personal compatibility, particularly in the post-war era. Meanwhile, medical progress offered new hope. Though treatments for hemophilia remained limited before the development of clotting factor concentrates in the 1960s, the mere understanding of its hereditary nature allowed families to manage the condition more effectively. Carriers could be identified through family history, and precautions were taken to protect vulnerable children from injury. This did not erase the pain of earlier generations, but it marked a turning point in the capacity of medicine to mitigate the disorder's impact. Cultural memory, however, continued to cast hemophilia as a symbol of dynastic fragility. In popular histories of the Romanovs, Alexei's suffering became emblematic of a monarchy fatally weakened by its own blood. In Spain, Infante Alfonso's illness remained a reminder of a dynasty in decline. Even in Britain, where secrecy had shielded the Windsors from direct scandal, the knowledge that Queen Victoria had been the origin point for the mutation colored the way historians assessed her otherwise triumphant reign. For survivors, the legacy of hemophilia was both medical and psychological. Families carried not only the risk of the mutation, but also the burden of silence, secrecy, and stigma. Carriers who escaped passing on the gene often lived with the knowledge that their sisters or cousins had not been so fortunate, and those who did transmit the disorder to sons endured cycles of loss that, though less visible in the mid-20th century, echoed the tragedies of the 19th. By the time the scientific community began mapping the genetic code in the late 20th century, hemophilia had already left an indelible imprint on Europe's dynasties. The carriers who survived embodied resilience, navigating secrecy while living under the weight of inherited responsibility. Their choices and the strategies their families adopted reflected a broader transformation in monarchy itself, from an institution defined by divine right and hereditary destiny to one increasingly shaped by science, health, and human vulnerability. The aftermath of the royal curse was not simply decline. It was adaptation, resilience, and change. Survivors of the afflicted bloodlines carried forward their families' histories while also contributing, often unknowingly, to the scientific progress that would eventually lift the burden of secrecy from future generations. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the story of hemophilia in Europe's royal families had moved from secrecy to science, from whispered tragedy to documented history. Advances in genetics finally confirmed what physicians of the Victorian era had only suspected. Queen Victoria was indeed the original carrier of the mutation, most likely through a spontaneous genetic change rather than inherited ancestry. Modern DNA analysis of royal remains, combined with extensive genealogical mapping, has made clear how one gene reshaped the destinies of multiple dynasties. The legacy of this discovery lies not only in royal history, but also in medicine. The tragedies of Europe's princes became case studies that accelerated understanding of hereditary disease. Hemophilia was one of the first disorders to be mapped to a specific chromosomal pattern, establishing the principle of X-linked inheritance that is now central to genetic science. Researchers were able to use the extensive, meticulously documented royal family trees to demonstrate how a single mutation could spread across generations and across borders. In this way, what had once been a source of stigma became a cornerstone of medical progress. Treatment, too, transformed in the 20th century. The introduction of clotting factor concentrates in the 1960s revolutionized care, turning hemophilia from a near-certain death sentence into a manageable condition. By the 1980s, gene research offered hope for more permanent therapies, and by the 21st century, clinical trials of gene replacement therapies suggested that the disorder might one day be curable. This progress would not have been possible without the early case documentation preserved, however reluctantly, by royal physicians and courts determined to record every detail. Culturally, the royal curse remains one of the most compelling illustrations of how biology intersects with power. The disorder shaped the lives of individuals, but it also shaped the fate of nations. In Russia, Alexei's illness contributed to political instability that culminated in revolution and the fall of an empire. In Spain, it weakened confidence in a monarchy already beset by crisis. In Britain, it forced a reckoning with the vulnerability of hereditary rule. The genetic reality of hemophilia became a metaphor for monarchy itself, outwardly powerful, yet inwardly fragile. The legacy also carries lessons in ethics. The secrecy and stigma that surrounded hemophilia reflect how societies once responded to hereditary illness with silence, shame, and superstition. Today, the openness with which genetic disorders are studied and managed stands in stark contrast. The historical memory of the royal curse reminds us that transparency, scientific research, and compassion are essential to overcoming not only the medical challenges but also the social burdens of genetic disease. For modern descendants of Europe's royal families, the shadow of hemophilia has largely receded. Genetic testing allows carriers to be identified, and marriage is no longer dictated by dynastic strategy. The institution of monarchy itself has transformed, no longer dependent on the rigid structures of bloodline purity that once magnified the risk of inherited disorders. Yet the history remains. In every textbook that explains X-linked inheritance, in every medical lecture on hemophilia, the story of Queen Victoria's descendants is invoked. Their suffering is remembered not only as tragedy, but as a turning point in human understanding. The royal curse was never supernatural. It was a mutation, a single change in genetic code. But its consequences, dynastic collapse, medical discovery, cultural myth, were profound. It illustrates how biology can alter history, how the fate of nations can hinge on the fragility of a child's blood. From the secrecy of Victorian nurseries to the laboratories of modern genetics, hemophilia's journey through Europe's royal families remains a testament to the power of one gene to shape the destiny of empires.